so happy to introduce our friend, our icon friend, Colonel Jay Stobbs. Jay graduated from West Point and was commissioned in the Army Corps of Engineers. Following completion of airborne and ranger schools, he served in numerous command and staff positions around the world, including nuclear weapons operational and effects expert. The threat of electromagnetic pulse was one of several nuclear weapon effects that he was involved in during his career. Jay retired after 30 years of service as a colonel and was awarded the Legion of Merit and Distinguished Service medals. He is an active supporter in our Icon Friends group and is also a busy man running currently for Chatham County Commissioners. Are any of you Chatham people here? Yay! All right, I think his wife's going to be back there at the table, so you can see MJ. So, Jay, thank you for bringing Dr. Carafano to us and for opening our program tonight. We love that you put this together for us. Thank you.
So we're going to get started now, and would you go ahead and put the slide up there? Got our technical guy here, Dave. All right. First off, are the lights okay? Can y'all see that slide back here? All right. I'm going to give you 3 terms tonight. I want you to write them down because I don't have time to go into detail, but I'd like for you to do a Google search when you go home tonight before you go to bed or tomorrow. And the first one I want you to do a Google search on is Starfish Prime. Okay? The reason this is important is because this event took place on the 9th of July of 1962, and it completely shocked the physicists and the scientists because we never knew anything about EMP prior to that time because everything else had been surface nuclear detonations. This was a high-altitude nuclear detonation. And the question is, why did we need to do that? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Starfish what?
Prime.
Prime?
Starfish Prime. There was a number of them, but the one with Honolulu was Starfish Prime. Thank you. All right. So if you think back, I look around here, a lot of you were around in 1957 when Sputnik went up. Remember that? And we started launching satellites. Well, there was a big uncertainty about the vulnerability of satellites to nuclear weapons in outer space. And so what do scientists want to do? They want to get some data, so we're going to do a test. So in 1962, they launched a Thor rocket from Kwajalein Island, and on that rocket was a 1.4 megaton thermonuclear device. That's a fancy word for a hydrogen bomb. It detonated at 250 miles up, where most of the satellites orbit and what have you. And guess what? Almost instantaneously, 1,000 miles away in Honolulu, Hawaii, everything was blacked out. The grid it was fried, went out. Traffic lights flickered and went out. People driving their cars, the cars stopped functioning. And panic kind of set in because what caused this havoc 1,000 miles away? Well, what you're looking at here, this is a picture taken from Honolulu, Hawaii, at 11 p.m. on the 9th of July, and this is what it looked like a shot. Now, that's a 1.4 megaton shot. And so with this as data, the scientists had to go back and say, we got to figure out what happened here because this was unexpected. So can somebody do a page down? Good, Dave. Thank you. All right. So these pictures are all from Google Images. I think I'm supposed to give them credit, so I didn't create these. But what I'd like to do is give you real quickly just a short tutorial on the electromagnetic spectrum. Our sun puts out all that energy from these different wavelengths of electromagnetic energy. And also when a nuclear weapon goes off, the same thing happens, but at different degrees. For example, when a nuclear weapon goes off, we get a whole lot more X-rays than the sun would normally put out because that's just the way the device works and the physics of the internal when it explodes. So let me just quickly mention here, gamma rays. You're probably not real familiar, but how many people in here have seen the northern lights or the aurora borealis? Well, I'm from South Texas. I didn't know what people were talking about until one evening at 2 o'clock in the morning. I was on a jet flying to Russia on one of my numerous trips over there doing weapons reduction programs. And the captain came on board. He said, look out the left side. He called it the port side, Navy term. And so we looked out there, and it was the most magnificent view I've ever seen. This blue, green, yellows. It looked like a curtain flickering around. Well, the northern lights are created by gamma rays. These are very high energetic rays. And I'm going to transition to the nuclear weapon because it's an effect that shows what happens when a weapon goes off. So the gamma rays, they interact with the upper atmosphere, and that's what creates our ionosphere. And what happens is it rips electrons off the molecules and atoms, and as they separate, they want to go back together again. One's positive, one's negative. When they go back together, it gives off electromagnetic radiation in the visible light area. And that's what you see. That's the northern lights. All right, I'm going to go on down. We all know about X-rays. We get our dental work done, do cancer treatment. They can be used for good purposes, but they're dangerous because they cause ionization. All that means is when they interact with you, they rip electrons off, and they can cause cancer or they can kill cancer cells. So they can be used well or they can be not so well. Ultraviolet light, cataracts, sun cancer. We go outside in the sun. Ultraviolet light, ionization, that's what's doing damage to us. So everything over here is bad for ionization. As we go past visible light, everything over here is pretty good. It's not energetic enough to cause ionization. Infrared, you stand near a fireplace, you feel the heat, you can't see anything, but also we use infrared for scopes, like night vision scopes. So everything that has warmth to it puts off infrared. Now, this is the biggie right here, microwaves. We all have one of these guys, right? Cell phones. I turned mine off so it wouldn't ring in here. Well, our cell phones receive and transmit on the wavelength of microwaves as part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And this is the problem we're going to talk about with electromagnetic pulse, because that gets transmitted at the microwave wavelength. So the bottom line is, I tell people, if you're in a facility and your cell phone, assume your battery's good, if your cell phone works, you're vulnerable to EMP because it's the same wavelength the energy comes in. If the cell phone doesn't work, well, that's necessary but not sufficient because you need to do further testing. You may still be vulnerable to EMP. Okay, now I'm going to wrap up this slide a minute, but over here we have how many shortwave ham operators in here? Anybody? All right, good. Oh, Dave over there. Okay. Well, the reason these work is they transmit. They don't create ionization. So if you speak Chinese, you can talk from here all the way around to China or India. You know why? Because those waves transmit nicely. Ionosphere, they reflect back. So that's a problem also with microwaves. Microwaves transmit they're line of sight. They can go great distances. You just need some repeaters like for your phone. So that's why microwaves are so dangerous when we get into EMP, is because they transmit very easily at great distances like we just talked about in Starfish Prime. Radio waves, this is what you listen to. Frequency modulated, FM, amplitude modulated, AM radio that we listen to our classical station with. All right, next slide, please. Now, where's my great aid up here? When I taught at West Point, I always come up with clever ideas here. This high tech. But what I want to try to let you visualize here for a minute, let's assume that at the neck of this funnel, this is up 100 miles above the Earth, and we set off a 20 kiloton nuclear device. Well, at 100 miles up, that's kind of what it looks like on the ground. See that circle? That's what you're looking at up here, these concentric rings. If I set it off maybe at 40 miles, height, same weapon, line of sight, see what happens? That ring is smaller. So that's what you're looking at here. I don't get applause for that. I thought that was
great visual.
Yeah. And so anyway, what this is showing us here are the various rings at different heights to show what can happen over the continental U.S. if one of these devices were to go off in the atmosphere, and you can see the rings of danger. Now, what I want you to just visualize for a minute, instead of the epicenter right here, let me give you a little scenario. Let's assume that over here in California, or down here where I used to live, right there in Corpus Christi, or up here in New York, a ship comes into harbor. It's got maybe freight or whatever. It could be a passenger ship, and it looks innocuous. But let's say it has a Scud missile on there. Scud missiles have been around for years. Scud missiles can carry crude nuclear weapons. So let's say that barge or ship comes into one of our ports, and the bad guys, whoever that might be, launch a Scud missile that goes up about 40 or 50 miles. Take a look at this. Let's just move that ring on down there. So what would happen is you would have probably anywhere from half to 3/4 of the United States would be blacked out because of electromagnetic pulse. This, ladies and gentlemen, is an existential threat. We can do something to counter it, but I'm telling you, it's been around for 50 years. Heritage has written on it. The Hillsdale College has written on it. If you look right down here, that's the website, but I've also given hard copies. It was written 10 years ago. There you go. I've got mine. It's the red booklet there. You can take those home with you, and that's something else you can study after you look up these words. But anyway, the EMP, it's not just one pulse, two pulses, or three pulses. We're going to get whacked 3 times. One of them I mentioned about the ionization. The other word I want you to look up is Compton electrons, Compton current, Compton effect. It's all the same. Basically what it is, when the X-rays rip these electrons off, the electrons are moving, and that's what electricity is. And electricity creates, unfortunately for us, microwaves. So that's the phenomenon. It's called Compton effect. Okay, next slide, please, Dave. I hope I'm not scaring everybody, but I want to get your attention before we... All right, so I mentioned the Scud missile, the crude. You all remember back in the 90s, Jimmy Carter going to North Korea and something called the Agreed Framework. Do you remember that term? Yes. Okay, the Agreed Framework was a piece of paper, came back signed by one of the crazies over there, that basically said, we will stop our nuclear weapons program provided you give us a little quid pro quo. It was into the hundreds of millions of dollars, food and different types of aid that we gave to North Korea, ostensibly so that they would stop their nuclear weapons program. So we know how that turned out, right? We started getting seismic readings, and just recently they claim they've set off a hydrogen weapon. So, but anyway, this is the threat. Now we've got Iran, and Jim's going to talk more, but think about Iran. This so-called agreement or treaty, they don't call it a treaty because they have to go to Congress, this piece of paper that wasn't signed by the Iranians that says that they're not going to pursue nuclear weapons. Well, if you believe that, I've got a bridge I want to sell to you after the meeting. Because the North Koreans have been working with the Iranians, they've worked with the Pakistanis, so they know the technology. So the threat has really, really grown, and we need to have our attention caps on. Next slide, please. Because these are not good folks. And so this is my last slide. And Heritage has been writing on this for some time. My wife, MJ, and I, we've supported Heritage for a long time. It's a great, great organization. James J. Carafano is a leading expert in national security, defense affairs, and homeland security at the Heritage Foundation. Before assuming responsibility for Heritage's entire defense and foreign policy team in December of 2012, Carafano had served as deputy director of the Davis Institute, as well as director of its Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies since 2009. He is the author of many books and studies, including his most recently published book, Surviving the End, a disaster preparedness book. Carafano also published Wiki at War, Conflict in a Socially Connected World, and co-authored Winning the Long War, Lessons from the Cold War for Defeating Terrorism and Preserving Freedom. Well, that's a long title. He serves on the board of trustees of the Marine Corps University, Simplify, my friends, Marine Corps, and advisory boards for the West Point Center of Oral History, the Hamilton Society, and Operation Renewed Hope Foundation, which serves homeless veterans. Carafano joined Heritage in 2003. Before becoming a policy expert, he has served 25 years in the Army. A graduate of West Point, Carafano also has a master's degree and a doctorate from Georgetown University and a master's degree in strategy from the U.S. Army War College. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Carafano.
This is great. This is really exciting for me. Actually, this is more people that show up at my wedding. This is like being on The View, except having an audience. Before I forget, the first thing I want to do is I want to thank you for who you are. I think organizations like this and activities like this are so important to the future of democracy in our country. I've spoken to groups like this all over the country, and something absolutely magical happens when people get in together in a room and they talk about an issue that they care about. And it's the difference between going through your tweeting and saying, boy, I like that, boy, I hate that, and actually engaging with other people, recognizing that this is something of all concern, deciding what needs to be done, and then oftentimes going out and doing it. So organizations like this are the future of democracy in this country, and people that come, I'm excited, I'm honored to be with you. So thank you for caring enough about any issue. I don't even care what you think about the issue, but the fact that you come together in a community and talk about these things just says a lot about who you are, a lot about this community, a lot about this organization. So thank you, and keep it up, and go find your friends and convince them to do likewise. I'm going to do 4 things real quick. I should do my definition. No, I won't do my definition. So 4 things. I want to talk about why you should worry about this. I want to talk about how it can happen to you, how we can stop it, and then what you can do about it. So to start that, we thought we would, if the technology is helpful and it doesn't get stuck like it did this afternoon, we want to show you an excerpt from a documentary that did a couple years ago. It's called 33 Minutes. The title 33 comes from the fact that anywhere in the world that you fire a ballistic missile, the farthest point on the earth you could get away, it could be here in 33 minutes or less. So it shows you the kind of the immediacy of the threat. And the film's really about missile defense, and we actually did it in 2007. But there's a section in there on EMP which I think illustrates it pretty well. So we're going to run that real quick, and then I'm going to jump back up. It's all up to date at this point to see it. Yeah, see if we can make it happen. So what's interesting is the guy that was interviewed the film is Bill Graham, who not only chaired the EMP Commission, but he's also Ronald Reagan's scientific advisor. And interestingly enough, when Bill Graham was a brand new second lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force, he was assigned to Operation Starfish. And they put out all their instruments, and the detonation went off, and all the instruments went haywire. And one of his jobs was investigating why this happened. So Bill was actually one of the first scientists to discover the potential of the EMP effect. When we made the film, I was brokenhearted because I actually had to go to Santa Monica, California to film that movie. It just so happens Bill Graham lives in Santa Monica, California. So we went by the house and we interviewed Bill for several hours. And when we got done, this is such a rare opportunity to have really the scientific genius. We were just throwing when you make a documentary, 99% of it winds up on the cutting room floor because you're just looking for that gotcha moment, right? So at the end, we're just throwing out every possible question we could think of, just looking for anything because it might be something we could use. And the very last question we asked before we turned the camera off was the cameraman asked, he goes, well, what would it be like after an EMP? And he gave that really kind of chilling, commentary about 1800. And we just kind of left stunned. And one of the things we did is when I went back to Heritage is we wanted to model this. And of course the problem is we've never had anything like this. And so what we did is some of my smart guys figured out instead of finding different ways to model it. So what we did is we looked at major disasters where there's a large loss of infrastructure in the electronic grid. So we looked at the things you might think of, big hurricanes, earthquakes, large blackouts. And then we just scaled it from there and said, okay, what would the potential problem be in a country of 330 million people? And then if the blackout actually lasted over time, if you weren't able to turn the grid back on, it was off for weeks and months. And essentially what we determined is everybody's going to die. And if you look at the findings of the EMP Commission and some of the reports that come out, some of the estimates estimate that up to if there was a large-scale EMP attack across the United States, and we lost the U.S. electrical grid, that 9 out of 10 Americans would die. And you kind of scratch your head and you go, how is that even possible? Because there's no like radiation or anything. I mean, you're not suffering the concussive effects of blast. And the answer is first of all, the first people to die is anybody that's compromised in any way in the curve of a medical condition. If you've got a chronic medical condition, you're going to die because there's going to be no medical care for you, period. So you're the first to go, and then people are going to start getting it. And then large numbers are actually going to die from exposure, either extreme heat or extreme cold. And the reality is the world's not coming to your rescue. Getting sufficient people here to support 330 million people is just beyond human imagination. I mean, even if you could get people here, who's going to feed and clothe and house and provide them electricity? So it's just not going to happen, right? And what people also forget is the rest of the world would actually be in a pretty big hurt. Half the world's human capital is in the United States. Most of that's in electronic form. All of that would be gone 1 second after, right? So half the world's knowledge would vaporize in an instant. And then you think about all the global systems in which the United States is kind of the heartbeat of that disappearing. And the rest of the world would be struggling to figure out how they were going to survive, let alone trying to come here and save us. So basically what we concluded, and if you look at the findings from the EMP Commission and things like the National Academy of Science reports, is there's very little likelihood that Americans could survive but the prolonged loss of the national electrical grid. So we actually sit around and debate this, like, this is the worst thing that can happen, which I know sounds like really creepy, right? It's like people arguing about what's the worst, it's really bad, actually. People actually don't even like to talk to me. I call I call my mom every single week, and the first thing she says is, "Don't tell me what you did today." So you get a bunch of these guys around saying, "Well, this is, how about smallpox?" But the reality is when you go through about every large-scale disaster scenario you can think of, in logical things that can happen in our time, there's actually nothing that potentially has greater genocidal impact on Americans than this. So how could this possibly happen to you? There's two ways. I mean, it's just basic physics. If you put a lot of energy through something and that system's not capable of handling it, it's going to short out. So if you've ever, plugged in your hairdryer in the bathroom and the lights go out, okay, and you know what's going on. If you've ever had a microphone on, walked past another microphone, you got feedback in there, and you heard that big squeal, okay, you get this idea that when a system gets overloaded, it either shuts down or burns out. And so the short answer is if you can create a massive amount of electrical surge, it's going to go into the biggest system it can find, which is the national grid and other things, and it's going to fry it. So how do you generate, first of all, that massive amount of energy? And also, again, this energy travels line of sight. So I can have the biggest EMP pulse in the world, but if there's a mountain right there and I fired it into that mountain, it's going to all dissipate into the mountain. So if you detonate it at high altitude in space, there's nothing holding that energy back. And if it's big enough and it's large enough, it's going to create this effect. So one way is through a nuclear weapon. Now, the reason why Starfish Prime is important is we never really thought about this before, because militarily, to have a military effective nuclear weapon, Jay and I love talking about this stuff because we used to build these things. I know, it's kind of, yeah. It doesn't come out right. So if you really want a good nuclear weapon, I know this doesn't sound right, but if you want a good nuclear explosion, what you want is a low altitude aeroburst. And the reason for that is you want the burst close to the ground because you want the massive, as much energy as possible to go into the ground and blow up the target to feel that physical effect. So that's normally what we think about with nuclear weapons, and the effects it would have on electronics were irrelevant, right? Because, okay, your radio might not work, but it would have been melted, so nobody would have kind of noticed that, right? But what happens is when you detonate the weapon at high altitude or in space, the concussive effects, the things that we think about when we see the movies and the old civil defense clips, the explosion, the fire, and all that all dissipates in the upper atmosphere, and you never even fear it. You feel the people in Hawaii doing Starfish Prime, you just see a light in the sky and think nothing of it. But the electromagnetic pulse, that is what is allowed to propagate. Instead of going straight into the ground, it's blossoming out like a giant sphere, and that's what's coming into here. So you can fire a nuclear weapon at a large nuclear weapon at high altitude. That's one way to do that. But if you weren't depressed enough, there's actually a second way, and actually Jay kind of clued you in that in his prologue, where he says, in a lot of ways, nuclear weapons are just baby sun, right? Because the same fusion is right.
Electromagnetic spectrum.
Yeah, fusion, right. The same fusion reaction that's occurring in the nuclear weapon is essentially what's happening in the sun. So it's just on a much larger scale. So in many ways, the sun is just a giant nuclear furnace, right? And the sun is throwing off radiation in much the same way that a nuclear weapon does. And we see that radiation all the time. And we see spikes in that radiation, which are usually solar flares, right? So we all know about solar flares. And sometimes maybe you pick up your phone until you can't get a good signal or something, or the guy comes on the 6 o'clock news and said, hey, something might have been sketchy today, and there was high solar activity. So we all know about this. Matter of fact, FEMA puts out warnings on this, right? Just like you guys know about hurricanes, right? What's a bad hurricane?
Katrina.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
There you go.
The hurricane that hits you is hurricane, right? So, you got these ratings kind of 1 through 5. Well, it works the same way with solar storms. They actually can grade solar storms. And if you look at the FEMA tables, they'll tell you for this level of solar storm, this is the kind of level of disruption that you would see. But what we haven't actually seen in our lifetimes is a massive solar storm. And we know that these occur, and they usually occur at 100, 200-year cycles. I mean, it's not like it's set by a clock, but they're on an unprecedented scale that we don't normally see. So the last time we saw one of these was actually in the mid-19th century, and nobody really noticed because
no electricity.
that's right, almost nobody had electricity, so it was not a big deal, unless you're a telegraph operator. If you're a telegraph operator, you notice because it was one of the few things that was wired, right? And so when the energy went into the wires, and it went into the telegraph offices, and remember your old Western movies, right? The guy with the little visor sitting there and he's, chipping away. And he's got that little paper tape coming out, right? Where he's recording the Morse code. Well, the electrical energy actually went in and set those on fire. So we had telegraph offices all over the country burned down, but other than that, nobody really noticed. It was called the Carrington effect. It was named after a scientist named Carrington who actually kind of discovered what this effect actually was. And so we're due for one of these. And I can't tell you whether it's going to happen. When I say due, it's like due in geologic time, right? So it could be tomorrow, could be a year from now, could be 100 years from now. But this is going to happen again. And when it does, it would have the same impact as a large-scale nuclear weapon. And ironically, as we've gotten more and more advanced, we've actually become more and more susceptible to these things, right? Anybody have a first-generation cell phone? Come on, admit it, right? How many pounds was it? They actually had that guy on 60 Minutes the other night. It's like this brick thing. He's got one arm with this huge thing.
That's it. It was a brick.
Right. So what's your cell phone look like now? Well, why is it different? Why is your cell phone so much smaller? And it's because the electronics in your cell phone are so much more exquisite now, right? Because they can do so many more powerful things using so much less and less electricity. And that's true for most modern electrical systems. Every generation of modern electrical systems becomes much, much more efficient, uses a lot less power, but the downside to that is it can't take a very big surge, right? So the more elegant and exquisite our electronics get, actually the more fragile they are to things like surges. And as we move to something, now we're moving toward what's called the smart grid, which is we're hooking up the internet into the grid. And all the electronics that are going out, or all these commercial electronics are increasingly incapable of dealing with this. Right? Even the military, which is interesting. So the military for years, Jay remembers this, because we did worry about EMP effects on the battlefield and continue to be able to cooperate. And so we would build hardened electronics, right, to actually deal with the EMP effects. And we were talking earlier this afternoon that they're getting ready to reopen Cheyenne Mountain. Remember Cheyenne Mountain was our NORAD Northcom headquarters that was buried inside the mountain, and we moved out of it because, Cold War ended and we weren't going to have wars anymore and we didn't have any enemies. And a couple of years ago, somebody said, you know what, maybe we were wrong, so they're moving back into Cheyenne Mountain, and one of the reasons for that is because it's actually EMP protected. But ironically, as the cost of weapon systems have grown, and as the budget of the military has gone down, the requirement to have EMP-protected systems in the military has actually been declining. So it's not just the civilian systems, the military systems are also getting more. But let me tell you, here's the good news. The fact that an F-35 won't be able to fly after an EMP attack is the least of your problems. Surviving will be your biggest problem. So you've got this threat which personally will affect you, right? Maybe you're the survivalist, right? And you've got your water and your freeze-dried food in your cabin in the woods. Well, maybe you'll live. You might be the only person living. And if you like living by yourself in the Stone Age, maybe you'll be okay. But the reality is almost everybody else you know and love is going to die. If this event happens, almost everybody you know is going to die. So what do you do about that? Well, there's two things you can do. The missile part's kind of the easy part, right? Which is you shoot the missile down before it detonates. Right? That's missile defense. This film actually talks about missile defense, not just for EMP, but for all threats. And because the missile defense, the beautiful thing about that is it doesn't care. It doesn't care what's on the missile. It doesn't care if it's going to explode at apogee and do an EMP attack, or if it's a missile designed to take out Los Angeles or San Francisco or Washington, which some people actually think is a good idea. The missile defense is just going to shoot it down, right? So missile defense is one important component of this. The more comprehensive the missile defense is, the safer you are. The interesting thing about the film is we made the film in 2007. That was kind of at the tail end of the Bush years, and whatever you think about the Bush years and President Bush or whatever, our missile defense programs had actually been revitalized quite a bit. We were on a very good trajectory. Yeah, nobody gets that.
Yeah, we got it.
Missile defense stuff.
We got it. Sure did.
Guys are killing me.
Thank you.
No. So we were actually in pretty good shape, and we made the film in 2007 really to make the argument that we finally are on a good course here. We need to continue this momentum. And ironically, tragically, what I can tell you is we've done actually a very poor job in the last 7 years, and we've really scaled back the program. We've really, yeah. We've actually lost a decade really of missile defense advancements that we could have had to outpace the threat. And at the same time, the threat has actually progressed significantly. When we made the film, it was right after we made the film in 2007. It was the first ballistic missile shot the North Koreans made. It blew up in 42 seconds. And we said, look, in the rocketry world, failures are part of the cost of doing business. That's how you learn, is you build and you fail, and eventually you get it right. And then we updated the film in 2009 because in 2009 they had a missile that flew over half an hour, almost half an hour. And now we actually think they have a functioning ballistic missile that can actually range the United States. And we're very confident that they actually be able to put a warhead on a missile now. And we think they're very close to actually putting a fusion device, which is the kind you can use to generate an EMP attack. So the North Korean threat has advanced significantly over this time. Nobody believes the Iran deal is actually going to work. Everybody believes that Iran's a future protected nuclear threat. Russia's a much greater nuclear threat than it was a decade ago, and they just announced a new generation of ballistic missiles that they're going to build. The Chinese threat's actually very opaque. We have absolutely no idea what the Chinese are doing. That should scare a lot of all of us. So the threat's gotten greater, and our defenses have not kept pace. So that's a challenge. That's a problem. But even if you had missile defense, you can't shoot down the sun. Although I know some teenagers that would be really happy if the sun never came up, so they could just sleep through it. But that's really a question of mitigation and dealing with the potential for that happening. And look, we could talk about lots of things, but you know what? You may lose your iPhone watch and feel bad for you or whatever. But as long as the national grid is resilient, the country's going to survive and the economy's going to get going again. But if you lose the grid, it's all over. So the real challenge is having a resilient grid in the face of this threat. And there's a combination of two things. One is kind of prediction and early warning. This is called space weather. If you're interested in it, you can go to the National Academy of Sciences website, and there's a report you can download and read all about it. But the more we understand about solar activity and how to predict solar activity, the better off we're going to be being able to take preemptive measures ahead of time before a solar event happens. That's important. Interestingly, the title of the film is 33 minutes, which is how long it takes a missile from anywhere in the world to get to the United States. Ironically, that's also about how long it takes a solar flare to get from the sun to the Earth. So again, you have about 30 minutes of warning. So if you understand solar behavior and you can predict 30 minutes out, you can begin to take mitigation measures about shutting things down, protecting things before the solar flare actually get here, warning people and other kinds of activities. And then we can have a discussion about the whole range of mitigation and everything else. I think that's so important. We've had a lot of discussion since we've been here the last 2 days. North Carolina is one of the few states where the state legislature and emergency management teams actually engaged and working and talking about this, and I think that's really important. The federal government's been working on this for almost a decade, and they've accomplished zip, which shows they're very consistent in their level of performance. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. If you look at cyber threats, for example, everybody says, well, the government needs to protect us from cyber threats. So one of the things is we did a big study on government cybersecurity, and the federal government's had some of the worst cyber breaches in history. And so their track record for cybersecurity is actually far worse than the private sector. So putting them in charge of cybersecurity, I'm not so sure that's so smart. Putting them in charge of the grid, I'm not so sure that's any smarter. So I actually think that the better solution may come from the bottom up. So as states get together with their own local emergency management teams and utilities in the private sector and develop solutions and answers in their state, I think we'll grow that, and as states come up with good answers like North Carolina and other places, we'll grow that more towards a national standard and we'll have a resilient grid. My own preference is really for solutions that are sustainable, right? The great thing about all these protective measures is they're kind of dual use. Missile defense protects you from any kind of missile. The kind of mitigation and risk reduction things you would do to protect the national grid from the solar flare are going to make the national grid more resilient, and that's going to be helpful for all kinds of blackouts and outages. So they are kind of important steps to take. You want ones that are sustainable, right? Which means that you want ones that make sense in the marketplace and that are going to provide resilient, reliable, cost-effective energy over time. Those are also the kind of solutions that are going to allow you to be resilient in the face of these kind of threats. So what can you do about that? Well, here's the remarkable thing about this. What we have found, and North Carolina is a good example, but we've also seen this in the Congress and Senate, is when you bring this issue to the attention of legislators and they actually put it towards the front of their agenda, things actually start to happen. So we just recently did an event at Heritage not too long ago with Jeff Duncan from that unmentionable state of South Carolina. Right. I'm sure there are fine people in South Carolina. If they're fine people, I don't know why they don't live in North Carolina. But anyway, and Jeff was a very interesting guy. He's relatively new to the Congress, and he didn't know much about this issue at all. But this issue actually came to him from his constituents, and his constituents constantly asked about the issue. He actually started paying attention to it, realized it's an important issue. Now he's a powerful advocate in the Congress for addressing this. So I think this is one where if you actually go to your state legislators and government officials and ask, what do you know about this threat? What are we doing about it? What kind of plans do we have in place? What kind of measures are we thinking about taking? That actually will prompt answers. Not just North Carolina, a couple other states have done this as well. So somebody's going to ask questions, well, why haven't we done something about this?
Money.
Well, that's a really interesting question. It's a good answer. It's just wrong. This is ironically not really a money issue. From the missile defense side, if you add up everything we spend on defense, and you add up everything we spend on missile defense and nuclear weapons and the submarines and the bombers and everything, that whole part is less than 10% of the defense budget. So these are not even the big ticket items in defense in doing this. And on the civilian side, we were talking before about this, about what would it cost. And I think we can have a healthy discussion there, but I think sustainable, achievable, cost-effective solutions that are market-based are not significant cost factors in the future of energy in the United States. So I don't think it's really about cost. It's just about perception of risk. And the reality is we like to worry about the risks we like to worry about, right? And we like to avoid and discard and forget the ones we don't want to worry about. So sometimes, ironically, the ones that are the most dangerous are the ones that we deal the least with, because they're just hard to think about that. And certainly when you say this is a genocidal threat, let's just not do that. Right? But ironically, this is actually a genocidal threat which is preventable, and it is really a question of just getting our leaders to wrap our head around this. And this is something we can take off the table. Is it going to keep you safe forever? Is it going to save you from Obamacare? No, right? But it's it'll give you another day to repeal Obamacare, right? So it's not it doesn't solve every problem in the world, but it definitely creates the potential for Americans to have their own future, and I think that's an important thing. So thank you so much for having me here. Thank you so much for coming this week.